Hey everyone, welcome back to Monster Island. My name is Nick, and I'm trying to watch every single Godzilla movie ever. This past July, I watched all 15 original Godzilla movies from the Showa era and made a video giving my initial thoughts on each movie. And you all loved that video, so I figured now's a good time to go back in and watch the next era of Godzilla movies, this time being the Heisei Era. Now, while the first era was fairly inconsistent in terms of quality, I'm actually very excited to watch this era. Just from reading your comments on the first video and browsing the Godzilla subreddit, the Heisei Era looks to be one of, if not the strongest era in the Godzilla franchise. I am also very excited because there's less than half of the movies here in comparison to the first video. Last time I watched 3 movies a day, 5 days in a row, and I am never doing that ever again. But since there's only 7 movies this time around, I'm just going to be watching 1 movie a day for an entire week so I don't die of exhaustion again. But before I get into the movies, I want to lay down a couple ground rules. Firstly, I'm just going to be watching the Japanese versions of these films, so if there's any differences in the American or other versions, I'm not going to talk about them. Secondly, and this should be obvious, spoilers ahead. I'll be going through most of the plots of each movie and how they all end, but granted, my thoughts on each movie are going to be pretty brief like last time. I'll also be ranking each of these movies as I go along, and then do a final ranking at the end if any of my placements change. And finally, I'd also like to apologize to the Godzilla fanbase for calling King Ghidorah in the last video. At least you won't have to stare at my stupid mustache like last time. So without any further delay, let's begin our dive into the Heisei Era with the Return of Godzilla. You know, I was a little concerned going into this movie considering how long it had been since the last movie, and just by how the series would progress after the stranger parts of the Showa era. But to my surprise, this was a pretty good return for the Godzilla franchise. As the Showa era went on, it felt like the franchise was glorifying Godzilla as a hero instead of the disaster he was originally portrayed as. But here, Godzilla is once again seen as a terrible threat with a very strong anti-nuclear weapon message. Godzilla reawakens after a volcanic eruption, causing a nearby ship to almost sink. The lone survivor gets rescued by a journalist who both unite with Professor Hayashida to figure out what to do. The Japanese government initially hides everything about this, but once Godzilla destroys a Soviet submarine, they come clean about everything. Godzilla eventually attacks Japan, and after a whole host of operations including shooting down a f***ing nuke, they manage to lure Godzilla to another volcano, where he falls in and gets buried. I think the strongest thing going for this movie is how it feels like a proper reset for the entire franchise. This had a great story with interesting plot points and very well developed characters. However, I wouldn't say this movie is particularly strong because frankly, it did not need to be nearly as long as it was. Several parts of the movie felt like they were stalling for the next plot point, especially the middle section featuring deliberation between the US, Japan, and the Soviets about nuclear weapons. There was also this really strange character played by a Japanese folk singer who called Godzilla a hillbilly and had this very dramatic scene of him running away from Godzilla. He just comes completely out of nowhere, but adds some random chaos to this movie that I'm all here for. So overall, while The Return of Godzilla isn't a blockbuster for me personally, I do think it's a nice return for the series. Obviously, top of the list so far, but I'm really interested to see how this stacks up with the rest of the Heisei era. Before I get into the movie itself, one thing that I already appreciate about it is how much time they took to produce it. In the Showa era, you practically had movies coming out every single year with a few exceptions, but Biollante came out 5 years after the previous movie. Of course, that changes right after this, but you can really tell they took their time with this movie. The story of this one felt really well developed and fairly unique for the franchise so far. Scientists recover cells from Godzilla from the last movie, and try to use them to create a bacteria to use against Godzilla in the future. Dr. Shiragami decides to help with the operation, but then combines the cells with a plant he had grown from his daughter's remains. Sure, I guess. This concoction turns sentient and turns into Biollante, all while Godzilla reawakens from the volcano from the last film. Godzilla initially defeats Biollante, but it later evolves into a dinosaur-like creature who almost eats him, but is once again defeated by Godzilla, who then returns to the sea. It's a pretty loaded story that actually reminded me quite a bit of Hedorah from the last era. The characters here aren't as well developed as those in Return, but are still very well written. Miki was probably the most interesting character here with how she could communicate with both Biollante and Godzilla for some reason. And watching the relationship build between Kirishima and Shiragami was great to see as well. So while I don't feel like this will be as memorable for me personally, this was still a damn solid Godzilla movie. I'll place this right above Return of Godzilla in the rankings, and I hope this era continues to be as good as it has been so far. Alright, so Ty, as your first Godzilla movie, so what did you think of it?
Oh man, where do I start? First I gotta say, Android M11, the GOAT. My favorite character.
Yes. You can't forget when he went full Terminator too.
Yeah, where he walks out, he rips off the arm, and then takes off the jacket.
If you could explain every single part of the story right now, would you be able to?
I could try, but I know for a fact I would miss something out.
The movie started with aliens seemingly coming down to Earth, who turn out to be time travelers from the future, and then they pick 3 people to go to the past, where a dinosaur who later turns into Godzilla is. They teleport him somewhere else, and then they leave the little gremlins called Doe-Rats, who later turn into King Ghidorah.
It turns out to be a ploy. The Futurians, they're actually a part of global militia, I guess.
After that, they try to get Godzilla back, because what else are they gonna do? And then Godzilla is just back because I guess he was already radiated because of missiles around there. The main characters blow up the Futurians' computer controlling Ghidorah, and then Godzilla just beats the shit out of Ghidorah.
The dude on the island who saw Godzilla before he was teleported away, the new, more powerful Godzilla was coming through. They locked eyes like long lovers, and Godzilla took him out personally.
And then after that, they go back into the future, revive Ghidorah, turn him into a mecha, and then fight Godzilla. Ghidorah carries Godzilla into the sea, Godzilla kills Ghidorah, they fall into the ocean, and then Godzilla just wakes back up.
I love the movie, though. I will say. The movie, great. Absolutely fantastic movie. The characters were so funny.
I'll say that I did enjoy it quite a bit, too. It's definitely a clusterfuck of a movie, to say the least. I will say that I think the previous 2 movies were better in terms of pacing, even though the first one was kind of all over the place. So yeah, overall, I did like the movie, but I do think it is overall the weakest of the 3 so far, so while I wouldn't say it's the worst Godzilla movie by any means, Godzilla vs. Megalon is still a thing. It's my least favorite of the era so far, so bottom of the list. If you've already seen my last video covering Godzilla, you'll know that Mothra vs. Godzilla was my favorite movie of the Showa era. So, nearly 30 years after that movie, does Godzilla vs. Mothra meet the quality of the original? The story of this movie once again was a little all over the place, kind of like the last movie, but thankfully not as much. It begins with 3 characters exploring Infant Island where they find ruins and a Mothra egg. They try to bring the egg back to Japan, but then Godzilla appears. Then Batra, an evil version of Mothra, appears, and as he and Godzilla fight, the egg hatches. Godzilla and Batra then disappear, and Mothra floats back to Infant Island. Then the Cosmos, the fairies from the previous Mothra films, get kidnapped by a land development company, leading to Mothra coming to Japan and destroying a lot of buildings. Mothra then creates a cocoon, while Godzilla emerges from Mount Fuji. Mothra and Batra turn into their moth forms, and while they start off fighting each other, they eventually team up against Godzilla. They eventually defeat him, but as they carry him out to sea, Godzilla kills Batra while Mothra escapes. I did enjoy this movie for the most part, but it did feel like the most flawed of the Heisei movies so far. Several parts of the story felt rushed or inconclusive, and the entire arc of Mothra leaving for Infant Island but coming back to Japan afterward felt a little unnecessary. And most of the characters fell into the background for me, with very little character development outside of the main characters. So while far from a terrible movie, it does fall pretty short from my expectations. Bottom of the list once again, but like I said, I'd much rather watch this than most of the Showa era movies. MechaGodzilla is back once again from the last era, but instead of being made by a bunch of shape-shifting space monkeys, it's instead made by the government to stop Godzilla. And yeah, while that does break up the continuity a little bit, they tell the story here a hell of a lot better than the original films. The main story begins with researchers finding an egg on an island, leading to a battle between Godzilla and a returning Rodan, which Godzilla wins. The egg then hatches into a baby Godzilla, which, oh my god, looks a million times better than Manila ever wishes it could be. Godzilla then comes to Japan to look for the baby, leading to MechaGodzilla being launched. Godzilla ends up winning this battle and then heads back into the sea. Rodan then appears, and after they use Mecha to nearly kill him, Godzilla reappears. Rodan ends up dying but gives Godzilla all of its strength. Godzilla then completely destroys Mecha, takes the baby with him, and then finally goes back into the sea. So while the story of this movie does sound a little convoluted, the pacing here is way better than the past 2 movies. Each plot point is given time to sprawl, while also letting characters naturally develop over time. Nothing here felt overly long, thankfully, and overall, this was just another great Godzilla movie in line with the best of the originals. And honestly, this may be a major hot take concerning the score surrounding this movie, but this may be my favorite movie of the Heisei era so far, and I'm just as surprised by that as I'm sure you all are. So yeah, top of the list. Let's keep going. I guess in the mood of MechaGodzilla, here's Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla. I guess. The government is trying to find a way to control Godzilla telepathically and gets Miki involved. A bunch of people go to an island where Godzilla had been spotted a lot and come across baby Godzilla. Oh my god, look at how they massacred my boy. They then try to control Godzilla, but after this asshole almost kills Miki, SpaceGodzilla appears and then traps the baby. Scientists believe that Spacey Boy over here was created when Godzilla cells were exposed to a supernova, with the cells either coming from Biollante or Mothra when they went into space in previous films. Oh yeah, Mothra's in this movie too for like a minute total. Cool, I guess. They then launch Mothra, or the Mobile Operations Godzilla Universal Expert Robot Aerotype. What the is that name? As SpaceGodzilla attacks Fukuoka with Godzilla appearing to fight back. They eventually learn that Spacey Boy is gaining energy from the city's tower, and after Godzilla destroys it, they're finally able to defeat him. And I've gotta say, for as much that happens in this movie, this felt like one of the more plain movies of this entire era. Most of the characters here didn't feel all that special, and the fights were mainly just laser effects and weren't that exciting. And Godzilla just felt like a secondary character for most of the film as well. And while I did like SpaceGodzilla's design and concept, he just felt a little wasted in this movie. So yeah, while not a bad movie by any means, it's definitely the weakest of this era so far. Bottom of the list. Alright, this honestly breezed by a lot faster than I thought it would. Good thing there weren't 15 movies this time around. So without any further ado, let's move on to the final Godzilla movie of the Heisei Era. And finally for the Heisei Era, we have Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. I am 90% sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I got that pronunciation from the Godzilla subreddit, so blame them, not me. So this film has quite the legacy behind it. This is the highest rated Heisei film on both Letterboxd and IMDb, and I can most definitely see why. This movie not only circles back to the original Godzilla film, even bringing back Emiko from it, but also brings this entire chapter of Godzilla movies to an end. This movie starts with the disappearance of the island from the last film and a glowing Godzilla destroying Hong Kong. We find out that Godzilla is likely to explode, which would cause the entire atmosphere to explode with him. They then discover a creature who has very similar effects on fish to the Oxygen Destroyer from the first film, who then rapidly evolve until becoming the ultimate monster, Destoroyah. And since Destoroyah works the same as the Oxygen Destroyer, they believe it could help destroy Godzilla and thus save the entire planet. They then find Godzilla Jr., who's now an adult, and they make him go straight to Destoroyah so Godzilla himself will follow suit. The three then get into a massive tumble with Jr. ultimately dying at the hands of Destoroyah, before Godzilla, with the help of the army, kill Destoroyah. Godzilla then starts to melt down, but is cooled off by the army to stop him from exploding. He then of course dies, but afterward, Jr. reawakens as the new Godzilla after gaining the energy from his father. That was a lot. It's also worth mentioning that this was meant to be the final Godzilla movie, and you can tell they went all out for it. This felt like a grand finale for the entire franchise, with multiple characters returning and plenty of callbacks to the original film. My only gripes with the movie are how the newer characters don't have a ton of depth to them, with the slight exception of Kenichi, who was Dr. Yamane's grandson, and the constant evolutions that Destoroyah went through got tiresome after a little while, but overall, this was pretty damn good. It's not my personal favorite of the Heisei era, but I can definitely see why a lot of people love this movie. Just looking at my current rankings, I can definitely tell these are going to change, like a lot. But for now, I'll place this at number 2 in the rankings. It's more than likely my second favorite movie of the era, but I can definitely tell you my number 1 is definitely not my number 1 anymore. But we'll see in a couple days, which for you all should be right about now.
One nap later.
Alright, it's now been a couple days since I finished watching all 7 of the Heisei Godzilla movies, so now it's time to rank them all. And just like I was talking about in the last film, these changed a lot from my initial rankings. Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, Godzilla vs. Mothra, The Return of Godzilla, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Godzilla vs. MechaGodzilla II, Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, and finally, Godzilla vs. Biollante. So yeah. The top 5 changed quite a bit. As I kept watching these movies, I realized how much I appreciated the story of Biollante and how much they poured into every single aspect of the movie. And while I do still enjoy MechaGodzilla II, it's just not as strong for me as it was originally. And I may be a little biased toward King Ghidorah since I chose to watch it with my friend Ty, but the slightly absurd yet greatly told story stood out to me more than before. So overall, the Heisei era of Godzilla movies was an absolute joy to sit through. I do think a few films were a little longer than they should have been, but each film felt complementary to each other. And while I do have a clear least favorite, none of these are bad movies. I may have found SpaceGodzilla a little plain here, but it's nowhere even close to as bad as All Monsters Attack from the Showa era. I love the cohesion shared between films and how the beginning and end tied everything together. I would like to rank these movies against the Showa era movies, but I haven't thought about those movies in months, so Maybe when I finish every Godzilla movie, I can go back and make a video ranking every single movie, but we'll have to see. But overall, I enjoyed the Heisei Era a decent bit more than the Showa Era, and I highly recommend it to anyone watching. The first 3 films are available on the Criterion website alongside HBO Max, so hopefully we'll get the other 4 films sooner rather than later. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts about these movies, and let me know your rankings in the comments below. So thank you all for watching, and take care.